on a serious note, people have probably seen the video of the car that was driven in to protesters, plowed at high speed into protesters yesterday in Seattle. We understand that one of the protesters who was hit by the car died. And, you know, the image of this young woman who died has been going around. And it's a very serious situation. Now, in this case, we understand this was done by an individual. It wasn't done by the police. It wasn't done by the government. It was done by an individual, according to the reports that we're seeing, who drove his car into the protesters in Seattle at high speed and killed one of them and injured some others. Very serious situation. But it's not the first case. It is absolutely not the first case. You know, we know that in Kentucky, there were police who opened fire into some protesters. We know that in Detroit, someone drove up to a protest and shot into the protest and killed at least one person, injured many others. We know that in Iowa, Korean War. We know that in Iowa, there was, an individual who was shot participating in the protests. The murderer was not charged, was released without charges. And around the country, there have been protesters who have been killed. And the mainstream media of the United States is not giving us a body count. They're not telling us how many protesters have been killed. A large number of protesters have been killed. We don't know how many that is. I'm telling you a few instances. Nicaragua, Ortega. I'm giving you a few instances that I'm aware of, but there's more than that. Protesters have been killed in the last few months. Mainstream media is not commenting on it. They cover it for a little bit, and then they don't cover it. Now, this latest death is getting more publicity. We saw Kamala Harris tweeted about it and others, but it's not getting any publicity. It really, for the most part, there should be a body count. There should be a body count. We should know. We should absolutely, positively know how many protesters have been killed and who killed them. But the mainstream media is not doing that. The mainstream media is not doing that. Billionaires writing it down. We don't know the death toll of the protests that are taking place. And that should be a source of outrage. Don't you think if there were people in China who were killed for protesting, we'd be given, the U.S. mainstream media would do its best to at least give us an estimate or a number of how many people had died? Don't you think if there were protests happening, in Venezuela, the government would at least give us, a number of how many people have died? But we don't have a number. We don't have a number of how many people have been killed for protesting in the United States of America. During the 1960s, there were a couple occasions in which people died at protests, right? There was a protest in South Carolina, I believe, against segregation, where the police opened fire on the peaceful marchers, shot them. There was the People's Park Rebellion in Berkeley, California, and an individual named James Rector was participating, and the National Guard shot him and killed him. And that was in Berkeley, California. And then there was the Kent State Massacre of 1970, where 4 students were killed when the National Guard opened fire on an unarmed crowd in Kent, Ohio, Kent State University, that were protesting the Vietnam War. 2 of the students who were killed were protesters. 2 were random students who were hit by stray bullets. We know about those deaths. But it seems like the mainstream media is doing its best to not acknowledge how many people have been killed. And thank you, Jacobs. How many people have been killed in the latest rounds of protests? Multipolarity. Mainstream media seems to be not highlighting how many people have been killed. We just don't have that information. It's not rolling in. And it's a serious concern. I mean, you can bet that if at the Tea Party, when the Tea Party was happening, when the Republicans were all being called into the streets by Fox News to protest against Barack Obama, you can bet that if a Tea Partier had been shot and killed, Fox News would have been all over it. There would have been biopic movies about their life. We would have heard that the evil socialist Obama, who was both a Muslim and a communist and a fascist, had ruthlessly taken the life of this patriotic American. They would have played it up. But you'll notice that CNN and MSNBC, that seem to be a bit more sympathetic to these protests around Black Lives Matter, they're not talking about the number of people that have been killed. I don't know the total number. I have noted a number of incidents around the country. Like I mentioned, there was Seattle, there was Kentucky, there was Iowa, there was Detroit, but there's more than that. I don't know the official number of how many people have died at protests in the last few months, but there seems to be a desire to make sure that that doesn't become the conversation topic. We know how many people have died from COVID-19. There are people that quibble about those numbers and say, well, some people say those numbers are too low because there are people who die of something else, and then they say it was COVID-19. There are people who say those numbers are too high because these people die of something else, and they call it COVID-19. Regardless, right? Regardless, we have at least some numbers of people who died from COVID-19. When there's a terrorist attack, they immediately come out with a body count. This many people died. I want to know. I want the body count of how many people have died for protesting in the United States. How many people have been shot or otherwise killed by police? How many people have been killed by right-wingers who attack these protests? We know that in Ohio, there was a young woman, Sarah Grossman, and she was at a protest, and she was pepper sprayed, and the pepper spray triggered her asthma, and she died as a result of that. The police took her life. They killed her, right? Because they pepper sprayed her. She was pepper sprayed, killed by pepper spray. That happened. Now, I mean, there are these little incidents we hear. There are these little incidents we hear about. But mainstream media is not coming out with a body count. It is not giving us a number of how many people have actually died in the last few months. Great Chinese leaders. And they owe us that number. We should know. We should know how many people have been killed. And the fact that mainstream media is not doing that shows they have an agenda. Because it doesn't make the United States look good around the world. The United States is supposed to be the land of freedom, the land of unlimited liberty and justice for all. And the fact that people are being killed for exercising their constitutional right to peaceably assemble for redress of grievances, that's in the First Amendment of the Constitution, that should be, something that really kind of blows a big hole in the narrative about the United States being this land of freedom and opportunity. Right? And, of course, part of the way that coups and military regime change operations and attempts to overthrow governments around the world are covered up is usually while there's violence going on in the country, they have peaceful protests that are covered, right? In Syria, right? A violent civil war by Wahhabi extremists has been going on. But when it started, there were some peaceful protests happening in Syria as well. And the U.S. media made it look like the revolution was simply peaceful protesters. Same thing happened in Libya, right? To set the stage for the NATO overthrow of the Libyan government, the United States government and covert operations staged peaceful protests in Libya and then claimed that the Libyan government was cracking down on them, right? So this claim that governments are unfair to peaceful protesters, they use it against every geopolitical rival of the United States. Any country that they don't like, they immediately find ways of accusing them of being unfair to protesters. That's standard. Venezuela, right? Venezuela, Russia, China. It's a big part of the U.S. international narrative is that, this regime that we don't like is being unfair to peaceful protesters. However, we know for a fact that a number of protesters have been killed across the country in protests that have taken place. In these Black Lives Matter demonstrations, in the protests following the death of George Floyd, a number of American citizens have lost their lives. And mainstream media refuses to give us a number. How many people were killed because they went to a rally protesting police brutality and racism in the United States? How many people were killed? We know someone was killed in Seattle. We know people were killed in Detroit. We know Sarah Grossman was killed in Ohio. We know someone was killed in Kentucky. We know that someone was killed in Iowa. Where else are people being killed? Where else are people dying? Where is this happening? Right? All these people did was go and join a demonstration around an issue that everybody recognizes is completely justified. Everyone recognizes that George Floyd should not have been murdered. Everybody recognizes that racism and police brutality are a big problem in the United States. So people that did what everyone basically, Bonapartism, what everyone basically recognizes is the right thing, their lives were taken from them. Their lives were ruthlessly snuffed out, in some cases by right-wingers who didn't agree with them, in some cases by police officers. People died for protesting, for exercising their freedom of assembly and their freedom of speech. They were killed. And the mainstream media doesn't even want to make this a scandal. The U.S. mainstream media doesn't even want to make this a scandal. They have decided it's not important. I am going to try. Someone says I should do it, and I'm trying to keep track of how many people have died in the past few months at these protests. I'm going to keeping track of this, and I'm going to keep highlighting this, because they shouldn't be able to get away with this. They shouldn't be able to say, oh, in China, no one's allowed to protest or they're killed. Well, there's protests all the time, and we don't talk about that. Oh, in Russia, you can't protest or you get killed. Actually, there's protests all the time, but we don't talk about that. But in the United States, look at all the freedom. And people are dying on the streets. People are dying on American streets. And U.S. mainstream media has decided that, well, yeah, we'll mention it in passing, but we're not going to dwell on it. No, people are dying. And you can bet that if people on the right wing were dying, Fox News would milk it for all it was worth. Fox News would say, oh my God, they were killed by the socialist government and Barack Obama is a But the left, these people are protesting against racism. They're protesting against police brutality. They're protesting around the issue of Black Lives Matter. And MSNBC and CNN have decided, oh, we don't talk about that. We don't go there. We don't talk about it. It's amazing. It's shocking. And it reveals the hypocrisy. It reveals the utter hypocrisy of what's taking place right now. So please keep your eye on this. If you see a case around the country, sometimes it's only the local news that even bothers to cover it. Send it my way. Tweet it at me. I am going to try to compile a body count of how many people have died, how many people's lives were taken away from them, how many people were summarily executed for protesting. Okay? I'm trying to keep track of it. I'm trying to keep track of it. If you find cases that are being buried by the mainstream, that are happening in local news, send them my way. I am going to try and keep account of how many people died at these protests. How many people have died? Because no one who wants to talk about it. Mainstream media is just glossing over it like it didn't happen. And I want to keep track of it. So I hope I've made that point thoroughly. And on that note, I just wanted to talk a little bit about protesting and protesters. The first time I ever went to a protest was in Ohio. And it was not even in my little town. It was a few towns over in a college town called Worcester, Ohio, where the College of Worcester, a small, I think Presbyterian college, is located. And there was a Quaker meeting in that town. And around the time, 2002, 2003, when there was talk of invading Iraq, there would be little tiny 5 or 6 or 7 people would have like a peace vigil in the town square. And I would go to the peace vigils myself. And they were very small, and that was the first time I ever protested anything. But it's interesting because having been born, in the 1980s, in the aftermath of the 1960s and 70s, knowledge of protesters and the role that protesters play was a big part of the culture. For example, one of the most popular movies when I was a kid was a movie called Forrest Gump. Have people ever seen Forrest Gump? It's a dumb movie starring Tom Hanks. But the character, Forrest Gump, is this mentally disabled man who fights in Vietnam and then becomes a Vietnam protester and then, starts a shrimp company and then invests in Apple. And it's a silly movie. It's like a through-the-decades movie about this mentally disabled Southern guy who lives through the cultural changes of post-war America from the 50s to the 80s. It's a dumb movie. But if you watch it, protesters are a pretty big part of that movie. And they portray the protesters as being disrespectful and foul-mouthed, and they're no good. But the Vietnam War is also portrayed in a negative light. It's kind of a dumb movie. But I grew up in my little town hearing a lot of stories about Jane Fonda. Jane Fonda was this actress from the 1970s who became a communist, basically. Jane Fonda was an actress, and, they'd always used to joke, oh, the vets ain't Fonda Jane. This idea was that Jane Fonda, because she had protested the Vietnam War, was a traitor to the country. And it was this understanding, and I heard these stories about Jane Fonda that were not actually true. One of the stories everyone knew about Jane Fonda is that Jane Fonda had gone to Vietnam, which she did. She went to Vietnam, and that U.S. prisoners of war in Vietnam, U.S. soldiers who were being held prisoner, gave her notes to give to their families, and that she then turned those notes over to the Vietnamese government officials who shot them for giving her the notes. Well, that's not actually true. What happened is that she did visit American prisoners of war in Vietnam. They did give her notes, and she delivered those notes to their families. She made a point, when U.S. prisoners of war gave her these notes, she made a point of giving them to the families. It was the exact opposite. She didn't get them killed for giving notes. She delivered the notes to the families, made a point of visiting the families and saying, your relative who's being held prisoner in Vietnam is okay, they're safe, they're not being tortured, and here's the note. And she delivered the note. So that was just a lie. But I heard that about Jane Fonda, right? And that Jane Fonda was just, Jane Fonda was awful. And it fit in with this whole narrative. And I lived near Kent State University when I was a kid. I mentioned that there was the massacre there. And I would always hear these people say that, they should have shot more of those students. They were disrespecting America by protesting. And I'd always hear this other anecdote about how Vietnam War protesters spit on our troops when they came back to the country. They spit on the soldiers, right? And later I learned that that's a largely a manufactured story. It was in the movie Rambo. Rambo, at one point, Sylvester Stallone is saying, they spit on me when I came back from Vietnam. And that, that military soldiers, when they flew in from Vietnam, they didn't fly to civilian airports. They flew to military airports. So the protests were not happening on military bases, right? That wasn't happening. So the story just doesn't add up. Were there people who were disrespectful of soldiers and told them they shouldn't do what they did and such? Perhaps. But the big story with Jane Fonda is that Jane Fonda actually made a point of going around the world to U.S. military bases and performing a performance. Like she did, it was kind of a circus performance that she did, around the country. It was called the FTA show. And she had rock bands, and she had different musical acts and performers, and it was called the, FTA stood for F the Army. And she was encouraging U.S. GIs to defect from the U.S. military. That's what she did, and actually there were she made a point of meeting, going to the areas where, in like the Philippines and Okinawa and Germany and places like that. And Jane Fonda actually made a point of meeting this famous movie star, meeting American GIs, being friendly to them and urging them to refuse to fight in the Vietnam War, that happened. And that's one of the most untold stories about the Vietnam War. It's not that the anti-war movement spit on soldiers. It's not the anti-war movement, said nasty things to soldiers, but the opposite. The anti-war movement recruited a lot of soldiers. A lot of soldiers joined the anti-war movement. One of those soldiers was John Kerry, right? Former Secretary of State of the United States. John Kerry, he was in Vietnam. He fought in the Vietnam War. He quit the Army, came back, and he founded VVAW, Vietnam Veterans Against the War. And John Kerry even testified before Congress about how awful the war was. He convened something called the Winter Soldier Tribunals, where Vietnam vets talked about the awful things they did in Vietnam, the atrocities they committed. The anti-war movement didn't spit on soldiers, it recruited them. There was also something called the American Servicemen's Union. that was, was headed by a soldier named Andy Stapp, who I had the opportunity of meeting on several occasions. And I attended his memorial. He was a member of the Workers' World Party at the time I was a member. He died when I was in the Workers' World Party. And Andy Stapp, he was a soldier, and no, he didn't go around spitting on soldiers. He recruited other soldiers to join the ASU, the American Servicemen's Union. So that narrative of the anti-war hippies were just going around spitting on our troops, and that's why you should never protest a war again. I heard that my entire childhood. I saw it on TV, on Forrest Gump, and in so many movies. It's not true. It's simply not true. The anti-war movement recruited soldiers overwhelmingly, so that's just not an accurate narrative. But that's part of how I grew up hearing about protesters. And largely the attitude that people in my little area had, and people, even when I was in college close to Cleveland, the attitude that people had was that people who protest are mentally ill, right? That was the attitude, right? And it's interesting because I live in New York City now, and that's not the attitude at all. In New York City, the feeling is that protesting is a thing people do. The teachers' unions regularly have protests around teachers' issues. Students go to support their teachers at those protests. Teachers, go and protest, and that it's largely considered to be acceptable to protest in New York City. The Democratic Party, the labor unions in the city, the NAACP, the ACLU, Planned Parenthood, even among normal, average New Yorkers, going to a few protests is pretty typical. It's pretty normal. But in the area I grew up in, there was a feeling that all protests were violent, all protests were illegal, and the only people who did them were psychologically deranged people. That was the attitude. It was very, very interesting, the attitude. I remember when I was in high school, I had an argument with somebody at my school. It was about Fred Phelps. Do folks remember Fred Phelps? Well, Fred Phelps was this right-wing pastor who went around with signs, God hates FAGS, right? And he would go, when a gay person would die, he would protest their funeral with nasty signs. Fred Phelps. And he was this minister, right? And he was protesting gay people's funerals. And that wasn't getting him enough publicity, so he was protesting the funerals of U.S. troops who died, saying that they died in Iraq as God punishing America for homosexuality. Not a nice guy. So I remember when I was in high school having to explain to some of my classmates that Mr. Fred Phelps was not a hippie, that Mr. Fred Phelps was not a leftist. And they said that Fred Phelps, he's a protester, kind of like you, Caleb, he's a protester. I said, no, he's right-wing. Fred Phelps is a right-winger. They said, but yeah, but right-wing people don't protest. Protesters are left-wing, and they hate America, and they spit on our troops. And Fred Phelps hates America, and he's spitting on... I said, but he's right-wing. Fred Phelps is a conservative. He's protesting against homosexuality. He's an evangelical. And they didn't get it. And I remember having that argument and explaining to people that not all protesters are leftists. And that was something people didn't get at that time. The people in my town were under the impression that protesters in general were left-wing and they hated soldiers. And that's why, and that's what I was told. And I was even called to the principal's office and yelled at, during the Iraq War, because there was this feeling that because during the Vietnam War, the protesters had disrespected the country, you should never, ever, ever protest against a war ever again. And I was told this by my teachers. I was told this by the principal in the principal's office. During the Vietnam War, the protesters had disrespected the country. So because of that, we should never protest a war ever again. That's what I was told. And it was this narrative. And it started really with the Gulf War in 1991, when they put up the 92, when they put up the yellow ribbons and support our troops. And it was like this narrative that got sent out in the 80s and 90s that the anti-Vietnam War movement had been too extreme and too radical, so therefore you should never protest anything ever again because you're disrespecting the country. That's kind of the narrative that a lot of right-wing people had, but it's changing. I understand that even in my little tiny town in Ohio, there was a very small Black Lives Matter demonstration in my little town, right? And that it's so trendy now. Protesting, the attitude toward it is changing. I also remember, what I remember is that, when I was in college, they had a college Republicans club at my college. They had college Democrats, college Republicans, and that I saw on the bus one time a woman who I knew was a leader of the college Republicans. I got onto the bus, and Haiti autocratic government decreed critical codes 15-year-old reduced alcohol. All right, we'll talk about Haiti. All right. Thanks. We'll talk about Haiti. But yeah, I remember, getting on the bus, and there was the woman who'd been the president of the college Republicans, and she knew me because I was politically outspoken on the campus. So I remember saying to her, "Oh, are you still with the college Republicans?" She said, "No." And she said, "Why not?" And she said, "I'm not a protester." And she'd explained to me that once the Republicans, around the time Obama got elected, started doing the Tea Parties, she was just not comfortable with that. Because she had this attitude that protesting, people who protest are mentally ill and crazy, protests are scary, they're illegal, and when it became the Republican thing to do to go out and protest, she'd quit being a Republican. I thought that was kind of amusing. And that, the Tea Party seemed to be the first time we saw right-wing people, like, protesting, right? It was like mobilizing their supporters to go out and protest. And that until the Obama election, right, the atmosphere among most of the right wing was that you just don't do that. Now, there were anti-abortion vigils. You would see anti-abortion vigils. They would gather with the image of the mutilated fetus and the cross, and they'd be talking about that. So you would see anti-abortion protesters. So that was right wing. So that was kind of the exception. Other than the anti-abortion protesters, you didn't really see right-wing protesters. But, however, around the time of Obama's election, suddenly the Tea Party was protesting, and there were right-wing protesters. And a lot of Republicans were deeply uncomfortable with that because they just had been trained with this narrative that protesting is not okay. It's a bad thing to do. The other thing that's amusing about protests is I do remember when I was in college, at the time the Iraq War was a big issue, and I remember saying to a number of the people I was in class with, hey, there's going to be a protest downtown against the Iraq War. Why don't you come? And they were against the Iraq War. Most of the people at my college were more or less opposed to the invasion of Iraq, and I would say, or the continued occupation. And I'd invite them to go to anti-war protests, and they would get this scared look on their face. I can't protest. I'm not a protester. And I'd be like, why? Oh, I can't protest. And it was this, they were terrified of protesting, right? Because of this widely prevailing notion that if you protest, you are insane. It was just this scary idea. To come to a demonstration was scary to a lot of these younger people. The notion of protesting was just, I can't protest. And a lot of the left-wing people knew the war was wrong, but the idea of going to a protest made them afraid, all right? Because their parents might disagree. Other people might disagree. They just aren't willing to go out and protest. And that always perplexed me. I remember explaining to people, and people would say, I don't protest. I don't think that marching around with signs, does any good. And I would explain to people, I would say, you know who Dr. Martin Luther King was? Of course I know who he is. He has a national holiday. What do you think he did? And I would point out to people that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who is at this point an canonized national hero, was a protester. And that was like something that had never occurred to people before. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a protester. And I'd be like, yes, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a protester. And they'd be like, but he's good. I'd be like, yep. But he's a hero. I'd be like, yep. But it was like it never occurred to these people that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., somebody that is widely respected, someone who's not insane, someone who's not, criminal, someone who's not violent, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a protester. It never occurred to these people. But if you pointed it out to them, they would go, huh, wow. But it showed. Again, the culture has very much shifted. In New York City, again, protesting is considered something that people do. People do it occasionally. But in Ohio, there was this attitude that only crazy and deranged extremist people do it. But now that's changing because now Republicans are doing it. But it's all kind of up in the air, and it's all changing. I'll never forget, New York City is a little bit of a different political atmosphere than Ohio, where I grew up. And one of the things that amused me about protests in New York City was that, the people who shout, who don't agree with protesters, they say different things, right? In Ohio, if you were protesting against the Iraq War and someone walked by who didn't like it, they'd say, you're a terrorist. Why don't you move to another country? Something like that. Well, in New York City, their reply was very, very different. And I'll never forget this, because this was one of the stupidest moments of New York City protesting I ever witnessed, of New York City counter-protesting, I should say. I was at a rally for healthcare, right? The Transit Workers Union of New York City, the TWU, was having a protest around the issue of healthcare. It was outside of the presidential debate that was happening. I think a presidential debate or a presidential forum. And there was a crowd of like thousands of people organized by the Transit Workers Union protesting around like they wanted a better health care plan from the Democrats, like single payer now. So single payer now was their protest demand. Big crowd of them out there. And these right-wing people are walking by and they shout at a crowd of transit workers in their uniforms, no less. They're in their uniforms. All their signs say TWU, Transit Workers Union, on them. And they shout at them, quote, "Get a job." I kid you not. Get a job. They're transit workers. It's a union demonstration. But that's, and I didn't even understand that one, right? Because, when I was in Ohio, people did not shout, "Get a job" at us, right? People did not shout, "Get a job." They shouted, "You're un-American, you're unpatriotic, move to another country, you're a terrorist." Never did people say, "Get a job," because it was assumed that, that we had a job or we wanted a job, right? I mean, it was like, but it's a class difference. See, New York City, the attitude toward protesters is a little bit different. There's this attitude that if you're protesting, you must be a lazy person who doesn't want to work, right? And they're thinking about the 60s and like people who lived in Central Park and did drugs all day. And they're thinking about hippies, right? And so I always was like, I remember turning to my other protesters, what do they mean, get a job? Like, what's the idea? Right? Because it's like, I mean, I didn't even understand it, but it was like some kind of anti-hippie taunt from like 2 decades ago. But that's what that was about. So, but, and they shouted it at transit workers. So it wasn't really a well thought out insult. I mean, the right wing has never really impressed me in the United States with their intellectual abilities. But yeah, I mean, the attitude toward protesters has definitely changed. I mean, the fact that in my little town in Ohio, people are protesting around Black Lives Matter, I mean, that's big. The fact that there's right-wing protests all the time. There did not used to be right-wing protests in the United States. It used to be the right wing was against protesters, period. But that has changed. We have right-wing and left-wing protests all the time. Now in the United States, we have big protests, and people have died in these protests in the last few months. So I'm just reflecting on the nature of protesters and protests in general. For many years, when I was an activist, that was almost all I did, was just protest. That was like my main focus of activity, organizing protests, going to protests, and I was in that milieu. And one thing I will say, I'm very positive on protesting. One thing I will say, though, is one of the problems with being a protester, somebody who just, you go to work and then afterwards you go protest. That's what I used to do. I worked at the insurance company. Every day after work, I was at Occupy Wall Street. And one of the problems with doing that is that you get into a bubble. You get into a bubble where you stop really thinking about how the rest of the world and how the rest of the country sees you. And it's almost like you're just trying to impress other protesters. And that can become a problem. And I think that in a lot of ways, like, for example, when I was a protester, I was a big advocate of what you might call Antifa kind of stuff, right? I would say, they won't give us our freedom, we shouldn't give them theirs, kick the ass of the right wing, the only good Nazi is the dead one. I would say stuff like this. I believed it. And the reason I believed it was because I was surrounded by other left-wing protesters, and I thought it sounded badass. I thought I wanted to sound like the tough guy. I don't believe in their free speech. But then, I stopped going to protests. I started working in media and such, and I realized what Antifa does. That Antifa essentially does 2 things. Number 1, it makes the right-wingers look like victims. Number 2, it offers no counter-argument, right? So on the one hand, the right wing, they get to be the center of attention because, Antifa is just anti, and they're wearing black masks, and they have no signs. So the right wingers become the center of attention, and they say, look, I'm just trying to be right wing, and these people are beating me up. Oh, it's awful. Number 1. Number two, right, there's no counter argument. So they get to be the center of attention because people are beating them up, and they get to look like victims, and there's no counter-argument to their ideas. So basically, Antifa helps these people get publicity, right? I mean, and on top of that, in some cases, Antifa attacks the media. They'll attack the media because they don't want to be filmed doing the violent stuff they do. So I'm at the point where I don't approve of Antifa. I think Antifa is actually helping. Antifa has nothing to do with the Black Lives Matter protests. And the right wing has created this hysteria about Antifa. You know, I mean, and the right-wing narrative about Antifa is pretty stupid also, right? Because the right wing has created this narrative where, you know, grandma, elderly woman is, going to the grocery store, filling, paid for her groceries. She's out putting her groceries in the car, and all of a sudden these men in black masks show up. Grandma, is that a Trump bumper sticker on your car? And she's like, I'm sorry, Antifa, I don't want any trouble. Please don't beat me up. No, we are Antifa. We shall beat the living sense out of random conservative woman. Yeah, that's what, like, Fox News would have you believe Antifa is. It's not that, okay? It's definitely not that, right? Antifa, they're going after actual Nazis. They're going after actual white supremacists. I don't agree with their tactic, though. I'll just tell you. It makes them look like victims, number one. It makes them look like victims. It makes the right wing the center of attention, and their arguments never get answered. Plus, let me add this, the Antifa logic is now being used to shut down the left. How many times have you seen Max Blumenthal accused of being a Nazi? How many times have you seen me accused of being a Nazi, right? That it's kind of serving the liberal order right now. So I just don't approve of the Antifa stuff. But at the same time, they don't care what I think. Antifa's not calling me up and saying, hey, Caleb, should we go and fist fight? They're not asking me. So, but I'm at the point where, because I'm not in the protest cage any longer, right? When I was in the protest cage, I just wanted to impress the other people in the protest cage, and my views were limited because I lived in a bubble. I didn't understand how the wider society was seeing things. And that can be a bit of a problem. And that is my biggest criticism of some of the leftist groups, is they don't really want to reach the wider society. They've kind of given up on most Americans, on average Americans. They assume that average Americans can never be convinced of socialism. They just want to appear the most badass and the most cool and badass to other leftists. And because of that, millions of Americans who would become socialists right now have never heard a socialist argument, and they think the left would look crazy, right? Because if that's what you're doing, if your game is to look more badass to other protesters, you're just going to start acting and doing things that are look even more and more and more crazy to average Americans. So, there you go. And so I'll give you that. But yeah. So, but overall, the attitude toward protesters is changing in this country. You look at images of the protests from the 1930s that the Communist Party USA organized during the Great Depression. You look at the huge black nationalist mobilizations that Marcus Garvey, that he mobilized during the 1920s and 30s. You look at events like the Million Man March that Minister Farrakhan organized. Protests are a big part of American culture. So I just wanted to kind of reflect on that for my opening remarks.